Hello guys, good evening. So before we go into the session, let me introduce myself. My name is Dinesh Kumar and I have nearly 10 years of experience in UI development and nearly 4 years of experience in Angular.js. And my day-to-day work is creating custom widgets using Angular.js for our projects. This is the brief intro about me. And our objectives of this framework is, first we will get to know what is Angular.js and why do we need to Angular.js. That we will be covering in this introduction to the Angular.js. Next, we will see what are all the features we have in this Angular.js session. After that, in this Angular.js we have one component called controllers. So how can we inherit the data in this controller? Those things we will be covering it in our third session. Next one is we will be covering about routes. So if you want to have this page navigation and other things, how can you achieve using Angular.js? The last one, we will be creating custom widgets, that is a components in Angular.js using C3 or D3.js. This is what our today's objective. First, what is Angular.js? Angular.js is an open source JavaScript framework. So it is normally built by Misko Henry and Adam Browns. Later it has been taken by Google. Now Google is building this Angular.js framework. And why do we need a JavaScript framework on the client side? Normally, you guys might have seen the other MVC frameworks in Java or .NET over there. Why do we need to have an MVC framework in the client side? So if we build an application with the MVC framework in the client side, we will be having more control on the UI. Then each and every components will be separated properly. For example, if you are writing everything in a single view, like all the views and the controllers in a single file, that won't be helpful. So we have to keep everything separated. That's why in the client side also we are implementing model, view and controller. So the model will be having all the data, whatever you are processing in the client side. Then view will be having your presentation layer, that is your normal HTML. Then the controller will be having your business logics and the custom validations, whatever you need to do it in the client side. This is the separation of MVC in our Angular.js. Next, so what are the features we have in our Angular.js? Okay, the first one, if you ask me, we have our data binding. This is one of the biggest problem if you are using any other normal JavaScript. For example, a jQuery. So in the jQuery, if you want to bind a data, what do we do? Normally we will be getting the data from the backend, like $Ajax or whatever it is. Then you have to find the element by ID or class, then assign this data to that element. This is what we will be doing. Then if you are changing any other data in your view, that is in the HTML, again you have to read the value and bind it to your model, then send it to the backend. But if you are using Angular.js, it is having two-way data binding. Because of this two-way data binding, if you are changing the view, automatically your model will get updated. In the same, if you are changing the model, the view will be getting updated. So what does it mean? For example, I have a text box. In the text box, if I enter any data, automatically the data will be available in your controller. Just you can send it to the backend, Java, .NET, whatever it is. Otherwise, if you want to do any other operation, you can do it over there. You need not to find that element and get the value. Those things you need not to do. Automatically it will be available. This is what we are calling it as a data binding. In the same way, I am changing the model in the backend. Directly I am getting the data and I will be assigning to the scope variable. And this scope variable will be updated and this will update the view. This is what we are calling it as a data binding. So one of the key feature of Angular.js. Next one is dependency injection. So whatever, if you need any other external modules, you can inject those modules inside our Angularjs application. So you need not to have all the modules in a single file. You can create multiple modules and whenever you need those modules, you can inject those modules inside our application. That is what we are calling it as a dependency injection. The third one is routings. So what is it routing? Normally, each and every web page will be having its own tab navigations. For example, we will be having like home page, contact page and settings page. So if you are clicking on home, what do we do? Just we will be reloading the page and we will load the next one, contact. If you are clicking on settings, we will be again reloading the page and load this settings. This is what we will do in the normal web application. But I don't want to do that. In a single application itself, I wanted to load the templates around. I don't want to refresh the page. So if you refresh the page, what will happen? You will lose the context. So all the script and all the variables, whatever you declared, it will become empty because you are reloading the web page, right? Instead of that, I don't want to reload the page. I want to load a content in the specific area. How can we do this? Those things you can achieve using routing. So we will be seeing about this routing in a few minutes. Next one is directives. So what does it mean by directive? Directive is an abstraction function of your AngularJS code. For example, in the jQuery or any other JavaScript, you will be having a ng just click event. So what does it do? It is calling some particular function. For that, they have written some logic in their backend. In the same way, AngularJS having its own directives like ng repeat. It will act like a for loop on the client side. I mean in the HTML itself. You need not to write a for loop and bind the event to the HTML. Just what you can do is you can write a for loop on the controller itself. So the controller, whatever data you have, that will be updated in the view. You can list it in the view. That is one of the awesome directive in this AngularJS. Okay, these are all the inbuilt directives are available, but I want to create my own directive. So how can I do this? That also AngularJS is giving option. So already they are giving more features in these directives, but if you want to create your own, that also possible. For a particular element, you can give a view as well as the functionality. For example, I wanted to create a directive something like hello Dinesh. So if I give hello Dinesh in my HTML, it won't be having any functionality or view. But using this custom directive, I can give specific view to the directive as well as this is what the functionality needs to be done. For example, if you are giving input tag in the HTML, what is happening? It is creating like a text box, and so whatever you are typing, that data is visible over there. That is the functionality and it is having the view, the input text type equal to text. In the same way, if I give hello Dinesh, that is just a element in HTML. For that element, we are giving our own functionality and the view that we can give using our custom directive. In our session, mostly we will be concentrating on HTML, how can we bind a view in this controller, then how can you share the data between the controllers, then how are we inheriting the controllers like parent to child and child to grandchild. This will be covering in the session. Next one is we will be discussing more about ng route and UI route. Later we will be building basic D3 widgets or C3 widgets using AngularJS. Instead of having more in this theoretical, we will see more in practicals. We'll show you the code. Okay, so first we have to understand the architecture of our AngularJS project. How does it work? In AngularJS, if you see, it will be having a directive called ng-app. So once you load your AngularJS script in your HTML page, what does it do is, it will look for this ng-app directive. Once it finds this ng-app directive, it will consider that whole page is a ng application. For example, if you are including this ng app in your body, so whatever you have inside that body, it will be the AngularJS component. It will be rendered as a AngularJS directives and filters. This is how AngularJS works. So let's see how does it happen. Normally, just consider this left side, whatever you have is your browser, and in the browser, just we will be giving our static HTMLs. What is it? Just it will be having code, whatever we have, div or ng repeat, whatever. So the ng repeat is code, it is there, but we don't know what is the functionality of the ng repeat. Even browser don't know that. We have to bind a event, we have to compile that. So how can we do? So whenever you load this in the browser, what does it do? It will find the ng app. Once it finds this ng app, the ng app will be having two methods. One is compile and root scope. This root scope is like a global variable for application. So whatever you are declaring in this root scope, you can access it all over the application. And if you are creating a controller, this controller will create a child scope. So the child scope will be available only for the controller. So now what does it happens? It will take the static DOM to this application, and the application passes this root scope with the DOM to the compile method. This compile method compiles your whole DOM with your root scope, and it will be giving you the dynamic DOM. So once this DOM has been compiled, your browser will get to know, so what is the function of your ng click, or what is the functionality of your ng repeat. All the functionality will be binded to your browser. This is how AngularJS works. Okay, then before we go into this controller inheritance, let's see how can we create a basic AngularJS application. Let's go into the coding. So what I'm going to do, first I have downloaded my AngularJS file. So you can see this Angular.min.js. If you want this, you can directly go to the Angular.org.js. You can download this Angular min file. Otherwise, you can get the CDN file also. Now already I have downloaded this Angular min file. Now I wanted to create a basic hello world AngularJS application. Let's see how can we create that. So just I'm creating a folder 1, application 1. Let me create a new file. I have created an empty HTML file over here, and I am opening that file in my Sublime editor. So just I closed everything. Let me open that file in my Sublime editor. Okay, just I have my empty HTML file. Let me create a basic HTML colon file. This is the shortcut for the Sublime editor. It will create a schema. And hello world. Hello world. Just I'm giving a title. So first what you have to do is you have to include your script. So where do we have our AngularJS application? It is in my library lib folder /lib/angular.min.js. Now this is where I have my script file. I have just given the path, right? Then what I'm going to do here, I'm going to declare my application. So before we declare, just see how does it renders. H1 hello world. So let me open this in the browser. Now if you open this, here we have loaded that particular AngularJS file. You can see it in the library that has been loaded into your web application. Now if I want to perform any other expressions, like let me put it right here, 1 plus 1. So what will happen? So let me load here 1 plus 1. Whenever you are loading it in the HTML, it won't compile anything. Just it will give your it will be considered as a HTML only. So what does it mean? It is your just a static DOM. There is no functionality binded. So what we need to do to bind the functionality, we have to pass this to the AngularJS app. So AngularJS will be having $compile and route method. The DOM will be passed to the $compile with root scope. So it will compile and it will give you the dynamic DOM. That's what we need to do. So you have to define your ng app. So you can give whatever name you want. Just first I'm not going to give any other name. Just I'm defining my app. Refresh. Now what does it do? Once you are included your JavaScript file, that is AngularJS file, it will look for a ng app directive. So it is finding the ng app directive in the root of your HTML. So this whole file will be considered as an AngularJS application, and this file, the whole HTML will be passed to your AngularJS app, and it will compile and it will give the compiled document. So in the AngularJS, if you want to evaluate, like in JavaScript we will be having eval method. In the eval method, if you want to perform any JavaScript operations, you can give it over there. In the same way, if I want to perform any JavaScript operations, you can give it in the double braces. In the double braces, whatever you are giving, that will be compiled over here. For example, I want to multiply 3 into 5. Okay, let's see. So it will multiply and it will give you the result. But if it is a normal HTML, what will happen? Just it will show you only the normal 3 into 5 with this flower braces. Okay, now because of this Angular.js, it is compiling and it is giving the result. Now we have created the basic Angular.js application. Now let's see what is the use of controller and how can we pass the data between the applications. Let me create a new script file. So over there I can define my app and I can define my controllers. I'm going to call it as custom.js. So I have created a JS file, so I have to include the same file right here. Script. My source equal to where it is custom. Just I'm giving my file name custom.js. I have included my file over there. So just let me delete this thing. I don't want it. Now what I'm going to do, just here we defined our app alone. But instead of defining my app, I wanted to name this application. I'm going to call this application as demo. So now I can define my app in my script. So if I want to inject it as a module to some other application also, that is possible now. I can inject the same app where app equal to Angular.module of your application name. So whatever the application name you have given, just give the same name over here, demo. And we are not going to include any other dependency in our application. That's why I can give the empty dependency. If you need to include any other dependencies like ng route or UI router, you can mention those dependencies over here. But for now, this is the basic application, so I don't want to include any other dependencies. So I just mark it as empty. Now I have defined my application. After that, what I want to do is, I want to create my controller. So over there, I can write all my business logics and the validations, whatever I want to do it from the client side. So let me define a controller. App.controller. So here what you have to do, you have to define your controller name first. I'm going to call it as test controller. And for this test controller, what we have to pass is, we have to inject the scope element, $scope. So with this $scope only, your object will be binded. So I have injected my $scope over here. I'm defining a variable, scope variable, $scope.name equal to welcome to webinar. Okay, welcome to Angular webinar. So this is my $scope name. So I have created one variable called name, and it is a scope variable. So this scope variable I should be accessed in the view. So what you have to do, you have to define your controller also in your HTML file. Div. So how can you create a controller? ng controller. It's not bg, sorry, it's a typo mistake. ng controller equal to, so whatever your controller name, it is a test controller. Now if we are mentioning any other contents over here within this div, everything will be considered as a view for this controller. So whatever the scope variable, you should be able to access it within this view. That is the use of specifying the data in the scope variable. For example, I have created my scope variable, $scope.name equal to welcome to this webinar. Now if I want to access the scope variable, what I can do, just in the expressions, I will be giving name. Now let's see this in the HTML. Here you are seeing welcome to HTML. Whatever I have given in the scope variable, that you can access it in the view. Instead of mentioning it as a scope variable, let me define it as a normal var. So this is how we will be declaring the JavaScript files in the variable in the JavaScript. So where name equal to welcome to webinar. So if I refresh the page, what will happen? So this name is not defined, so it is not giving anything. You can see right here, normally in the JavaScript or Java, without defining a variable, if you try to access, it will throw error. But here you are not seeing any error. In the console you can see it. All the error message will be handled if you are using within this expressions, Angular expressions. It will be handled properly. Okay. Now instead of making a name, let me make it as a scope variable, scope.name. Now this will be accessible in the view. So you are displaying this particular HTML right here. If you want to do the same in the jQuery, what do? We will be taking this particular div id or class and you have to bind the element dot text of this value or anything. So here we are not at all doing anything. Just we are defining our scope variable and we are displaying the scope variable in our view. Isn't it really simple? We will do the another one. We are calling it as something as two-way binding. So what does it mean by two-way binding? Let's see that. I am defining it as a h1 tag. So whatever it is here, let me put it. Then I am creating an input type equal to text and model equal to name. So whatever the scope variable you created in the controller, those variables you can access it over here with this directive called ng model. Now it will put this particular scope variable value as a text box value. Let's see that in the browser. Now here you are saying, I didn't write any other code. Just I have defined my scope variable here and here I made it and given the same scope variable to the ng model. So it is giving the same text box value to the text box. If I edit in the text box, automatically the data will be updated. You can see it over there. So this is what we are calling it as a two-way binding. Whenever I change the view, this text box is my view. Whenever I change the view, this model, actually whatever we defined here, name, the scope variable automatically is getting updated. If you want to do the same thing in the normal jQuery, what will happen is you have to watch this keyup event. Whenever the keyup event happens, get the value of the text box and bind it to any other element. Those things you need not to do it over here. Because of this two-way binding feature, whatever you are entering in the text box, that will be automatically updated in the model. This is what we are calling it as a two-way binding. Do you guys have any questions? So if you have any other question, just we'll spend 5 minutes for this and whatever you have question, I will answer it guys. Then we can move to the controller inheritance. So from Ankit, I got a question. What is dependency? Right here. So for now, we are using a simple application. Instead of simple application, I want to use any other external application also inside my app. So how can I do this? For that, you have to inject your external application to this using our dependency injection. In our next demo, we will see how can we inject a ng route or UA route inside the application. Okay, so if you want to access any other external application, you can inject those things in our application using dependency injections. So from Saswat, I got a question. Is it supported in all the browsers? Angular.js is supported in all the latest browsers like Firefox, Chrome, Opera, and the latest IE also. From Neeraj, we have a question. How can this variable be declared as a global? Okay. So, for example, this name can be accessed. Now, you are seeing this ng name. This name can be accessed only in this particular controller. So, if you want to access the same name in multiple controllers, what you can do, one way is you can use it as a root scope. So, if you are using as a root scope, that will be considered as a global variable. You should be able to access it in all the pages. But the trouble with the root scope is, if you are defining any variable as a root scope data, whenever you are changing the data, your whole application data will be again updated. So it will affect the performance. So you should not define anything as a root scope variable. But if you want to make it as a global, you can share it by creating the services. This is how you can create a global variables in Angularjs, by sharing the services. So from Suswat again we have a question. Is there a workaround for old browsers? If you are using IE8, it is supported, and IE7 very much less. But the later versions, whatever you are using Angularjs like 1.4 and 1.3, it is not at all supporting. But if you want to use it in the old browser, you have to use id equal to ng app in your HTML root. If you use it over there, so you should be able to access this Angularjs application in your old IE. But all the latest browsers is fully supported with Angularjs. From Pramod, we have a question. Normally, what kind of data we will keep in the root scope? So, sometimes what will happen, we won't be having much time to develop a web application by creating data and sharing the data with the services. For example, today night if we have a demo, what will happen? Just we will be creating everything in the global variable, then you should be able to access it in the application. But that is like a workaround. It is not a permanent solution. If you have a very small application, you can have it in the root scope. That won't affect much. But for example, consider I have 30 or 40 controllers in my web application. So if I have 30 or 40 controllers, so what will happen if I make small change in my root scope variable? Let's do that. Here I am going to define this as a root scope variable. So if you want to define it as a root scope variable, instead of scope, you have to inject a root scope. I have injected a root scope. This has been created as a root scope variable. If I see it over here, the same thing you can see. If I change anything, it will be binded. Okay, so I am using this variable outside of the controller. The controller scope only between this. But I am trying to use this variable outside of the controller. Still I should be able to use this one because of defined as a root scope variable. Whenever I make a change, what is happening? All the child of the scope variable will be updated. So whenever you make a change, the $watch event will trigger. Once the watch event triggers, it digests your all scope variable. Now if I define it as a scope variable, only this scope variable, whatever I defined in this controller, this thing only will get updated. But if I mention it as a root scope, all the controllers, if I have 80 controllers, all 80 controller scope variable will be updated, so it will reduce the performance. Okay guys, let's go into the next module, that is controller inheritance. Okay, so the controller inheritance. What does it mean by controller inheritance? It is just like normal our Java inheritance. If you want to access your parent variables and methods, we will be using inheritance in our Java. So we inherit our parent class to the child. So in the child, you should be able to access all defined methods and variables inside your parent. In the same way, whatever the scope variables and scope methods you defined in the controller, everything you should be accessed in your child controller. So right here I have written a piece of code. My first one is div ng controller is your parent controller. Over there I have defined an input type equal to text and the model is name. So inside the parent controller I have created one more controller, that is your child. So if I just print the child, what will happen? Whatever I have returned in the parent, that will be available in the child. you should be access all your parent scope variable in the child. So if you want to override also, you can override it in the child, but that won't be reflected in your parent controller. Just it will be overwritten in your child itself. Why do we need this controller inheritance? If I want anything, just I can define it in my child controller itself. Then why do we need to inherit it? For example, inside one controller, I may have 5 or 6 controllers. So all controllers I wanted to use the same functionality. So instead of copy pasting the same functionality in all 5 controllers, I will be defining it only in a parent controller. So from the parent controller, I should be able to use those function in all the child controllers. If I have 5 child controllers, on all of the 5 controllers should be able to use this parent controller function. It is mainly uses to enable the polymorphism and the code reusability. That is the main advantage of using controller inheritance in our web application. Let's see a basic demo on this controller inheritance. So again, let's go to our code. So here, instead of creating only one controller, I am going to make multiple controllers. First controller is my parent controller. Here I have the name, and the same way I have the ng model also. Again, inside this controller, I am going to define another controller called child controller. My child controller also I have defined right here. Here also I am going to print. So let's put a clear separation. This is child controller. Here it will be a parent controller. In the same way, let me define the names over here. H2, whatever name I have defined. Then I am defining the same input object. Input type equal to text, ng model equal to name. So what I am doing, just I am trying to access the same scope variable whatever defined in my parent controller. Let's do this. So let me go here. So here I have to define a parent controller instead of test controller. Parent controller, and instead of a root scope, let's make it as a scope. Here you can see I'm defining 2 times the same scope variable. What I'm doing is, so whoever worked on this node or the minification of the file. So for example, if you are working in this node application, what will happen? So whenever you deploy your code, we will be compressing all the HTMLs and JavaScript, everything. So here I have each and every time I have to use it as a root scope.name. It is taking more space also, and it will increase your page weight. So instead of that, here it will be defined as a and this scope variable also you can define it as a.name. So this particular scope will be passed to this variable. That's why we are defining it as a 2 times. But now for the development purpose, if I define it as a, now I know this is a is for the dollar scope. Later, if some people comes and see, for example, you won't be having 1 or 2 lines of code. It will be 500 or 300 lines of code in the file. Okay, so in between a.name. So they will get confused. They have to go top and they have to see what is this a. Then only they will get to know a is dollar scope variable. So for the development purpose, we will have it like a whatever the scope variable, the same name. But whenever we deploy it, we have some kind of grunt or any other task runner, it will compress your file. So that time automatically this variable will be changed to some other variable name with some less length like a, b, c, whatever it is. Okay, so we can reduce the whole page size. Now what happened? Just I defined it right here. From parent 1. From parent 1. Okay. Now if I run this, I will get a error because I have to define my child controller also. Let me define the child controller. my child controller the same scope variable, but I am not going to create any scope variables over here. Just I define my child controller alone, nothing is there. I defined a name only in my parent controller, the child controller is empty, but I am accessing the name in my child controller. You can see it right here. Let me refresh the page. Now you are seeing right here, this is my parent controller. In the parent controller, whatever data I have it over here, $scope name equal to from parent 1. So it is coming from parent 1 and the text box also is having the data. If I change anything in the text box, it is changing in parent controller as well as in the child controller. Okay, this is what we are calling as inheritance. So this particular scope variable has been inherited from your child controller. This child controller is accessing your parent controller scope, but we can use overwriting also over here in the application. For example, if I want to overwrite the data, it will be overwritten only in the child controller, not in the parent. Just we are overwriting the parent controller scope in the child controller. Okay, so now what happened? Already this child controller is having some data. That's why this is not getting affected. Okay, so this is how you can overwrite the data from your parent controller to the child controller. Let's see this also. Now I have defined two controllers, one controller within another controller. Let's try to access the same scope variable outside of the controller. Here I am going to define another controller. Div ng controller equal to second controller. Okay, here if I try to access that variable name, let me put a tag, then only we'll get to know where do we have this third controller, second controller. Okay, refresh. Now I am trying to access the name. Already we didn't define this controller also, that's why we are getting the error. Let me define the controller. So what is this controller name? Is second controller. Okay, now I define the second controller, but whatever data I defined in my first, it is not accessible in my second controller. Am I right? This controller scope will be accessible only within this controller area, view. This is what we are calling it as a view. Okay, so whatever you define inside this controller, here this view only gets update if you are changing the scope, and the scope variable can be accessible only in this view. So if you want to access the same scope variable over here in these controllers, what you can do, you can create a service, and with this service you should be able to share the data between multiple controllers. Otherwise, let's see this also. Instead of sharing the data with the service, now I am going to share it with the root scope. So if I define it in the root scope, let's see the result. Now you can see the data in second child controller as well as in the second controller also. Because the root scope will act like a global variable. So whatever data you are defining in your application with the root scope, that will be accessible in all the controllers, as well as you can access it in the outside of the controller also. Now this is your first controller scope and this is your second controller scope. Now outside of the controller, here I am trying to access this variable h1 outside of controller. Let's print this data name. Whenever I print, here you are seeing the data from parent 1. So this root scope variable should be accessible in everywhere. But the only trouble, if you are using a very large scale application, if you define anything in the root scope, once you update the root scope, it will update your whole scope variables, whatever you have it in your application. that will affect the performance. So mostly you have to try to avoid using these root scope variables in your application. So do you guys have any other question in this controller inheritance? If yes, you can post your questions. I will be answering for the next 5 minutes. So from Devendra we have a question. What editor you are using? This is a Sublime editor. I feel it is one of the best editor for the UI developers. All the plugins are available over here for CSS3, SAS, Control, Angular.js, jQuery. So you can use this editor. So now the best editor. So from Tanvi we have a question. Do we have only the scope and root scope, or do we have any other variables? We have only just these two methods. One is the root scope and another one is the scope variable. We don't have any other variables. If you are defining a normal local variable in your controller, that can't be accessed in your view. But you can define normal local variables, but that can't be accessed. So from Avinash, we have a question. Since we define the parent controller, inner elements will automatically access the scope variable. Exactly. Because it is inheriting the data from your parent controller. It can access all your scope variable, whatever you define in the parent controller. Right here, you are seeing the data. Now, I defined this data in my parent controller. This can be inherited to this child. So the child can access this particular parent data. So from Gaurav we have a question. Can we pass a controller as a dependency into another controller? That is not possible. So you can pass only services, factories, values, constants to the controllers, not controller within another controller. If you want to share the data between the controller, you have to create a service or factory. With those things only you can share the data. You can't directly pass the controller within another controller. So from Ajit we have a question. How can I get one controller scope variable in another controller with root scope? So if you are defining it as a $scope variable in your controller, that you can't be accessed by your root scope. So if you are planning to use root scope variable in your controller, the root scope is totally shared with your application. So whatever you are defining as a root scope, that will be available all over the application. So you will not to define anywhere. Again from Ajit we have a question. Without root scope, how can we share the data? So if you are not using the root scope, the only way to sharing the data is you have to create the services. In the services, pass your scope variable and inject that particular service into the another controller. Over there, you can see it. So Gaurav is asking, is controllers are singleton in nature? Exactly, if the controllers are singleton in nature. First let me tell you guys, what does it mean by singleton? Singleton means, whenever you launch your app, it will get instantiated only once. In your application, controller, services, config, everything are singleton objects, but factory is not a singleton. So from Kanvi we have a question. You created a name variable that is the key or user defined. Can we create our own variable? So just this $scope.name is a normal variable. You can define whatever you want. Instead of this, you can create like ABC. So now ABC will be a variable. Over here, I have to access everything with my ABC. It is just a variable, nothing else. Now I should be able to access it right here. Now you are seeing by ABC. Okay, it is just a variable. Okay, now let's move to the next module, that is routings in Angular.js. So we have seen the demo of controller inheritance. Next one is Angular.js routes. So basically, what does it mean by routes? If you want to load a particular template within a HTML, you should be able to load it with the routes. Before, what we do, we will be having in iframes or the frame. With the frame, you should be able to load a content within a content. That's how we will be doing. Instead of do that, if you want to load a web template within the another HTML, you can use ng router or UI router in Angular.js applications. These are the two main modules for this routing. This ng router is built by core Angular.js team, but the trouble with this ng router is you can't use nested routes, or if you want to use multiple views inside a single HTML page, those things are not possible in ng router. But if you want to use the child routes, for example, let's take our Amazon web page. In the Amazon web page, you will be having the main menu, that is home, products, settings, contacts, or whatever it is. Okay, this is the main menu. Whenever you click on the home page will be loaded. Product page will be loaded in the specific container. But inside the product page, you will be having multiple links again. In the products, you will be having electronics or dresses. This kind of, again, inside one more link you may have. So if I click on electronics, I have to load the electronics content over there. So this is what we are calling it as a child route. If you want to use this child routes, you have to go with this UI router instead of ng router. ng router child routes are not possible. So we will be using the UI router. In the UI router, it will consider the state instead of your $route parameters. Okay. Over here, if you see it in the ng router, it will look for the browser URL. So whatever comes after the hash, for example, #home/contacts. So it will take, okay, this is the URL. Then for this particular URL, I want to load a specific template. So this is how ng router will work. Instead of that, I want to look for a state. So it will give more options over here. For example, the state within a state is possible. Multiple states in a single view, that is also possible. That is the difference between the ng router and UI router. So if you want to build a very complex applications, that time you can use UI router for this multiple routes. But now I want to create just a basic application, just 4 plain tabs. If I click on each and every tab, I have to load those contents out. That time you can use normal ng router. But now we will see the demo of ng router as well as this UI router. Let's go to our page again. Let me clear everything. So it may confuse. I cleared everything. Just I have defined my application and I have my ng app. This is through we defined our application and our Angularjs file, custom.js. Here also I will be deleting everything. Just I have my app. Just I define my application right here. Now I want to use ng router in my application. So if you want to use ng router, you have to include one more script file. And the source is, so I have it over here. Like for if you want to use ng router, you have to include this Angular route.min.js. This will be available in Angularjs.org. From there you can download this script file also. Now I want to use this Angular route. Let's go here and include it in our HTML. .js. So we included that script file over here. But if you are using normal JavaScript, if you include the file, you should be able to access all the functionalities available inside this file. But here in Angularjs, if you want to access those functionalities, what you have to do, you have to include that module as a dependency module for your application. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to include this as a dependency for this ng route. This is the module name of Angular route that has been included as a dependency for our application. Once it is included, so what I have to do, I want to configure the routes. Okay, just before we include, let's do this. I'm creating a div. Just create some tags. #home /contact. Okay, let's open this in the browser. Okay, so whenever I click on this home, this has become hash home. Now you are seeing right here in the URL. After hash, you are seeing /home. If you click on contact, you will be getting the contact. But whenever it becomes a home, I want to load the home template over here, right here in the bottom. In the same way, if I click on contact, I want to load the contact. How can I do this? For this, we will be using a ng router. Now I included my ng router as a dependencies to the application. Again, now you have to create the configuration file for your ng app. In Angular.js, we have one more feature that is a module called config. So once you launch your application, automatically it will go to this config. Whatever you defined over there, it will execute it. So we can define our configuration of our ng router in this config method. Config, and this function, after you include this ng router is having some functionalities like $route providers or URL router provider. Now I just need only $route provider. Route provider. Okay, that has been included. Now if I want to configure this route, how can we do is $route provider dot when your URL is /home, you have to load this particular template. So here you can define your HTML as a template, or you can mark it as a template URL, and you can load the HTML from the outside also. But now let me define it as a normal template. Template, home template, okay? Just I'm going to call it as a home template. Home template. Then another one also we have, one is the home, /home, it will load the home template. And if it is a contact, what can I do? For that also you have to create your config. When this is /contact, whatever you have given right here, this URL, when it is /contact, it has to load the template div, and I want to load contact template. It is done. Now you have defined your routes, but whenever I get this /home or /contact in the URL, where do I need to load this template? That you have to define. For that, I am going to define it right here. Div, whenever I get the URL as a /home, load this specific template over here. Ng view. So this is the directive available inside this specific file. Angular router.min.js. This directive will be available. So if I mention this ng view, it will be like a placeholder. So this template will be loaded in this ng view. If I change it as home, this home template will be loaded. Contact template will be loaded. This is how we will be configuring the Angular.js routes. Let me open this in the browser. Now nothing is loaded. Whenever I click on home, 1 minute, let me see any other error. So we missed braces, that is the error. Let me go here and let's give, come on. So this is what the error, home /. Now before it will be like this, home, okay? Whenever this is nothing is there. So if nothing is there, here it won't come to this configuration page because it is not finding /home as well as it is not finding contact. So it won't load any other template. Whenever I click on home, this URL has become /home. If your URL becomes /home, it will come over here and it will load this specific template, home template. Where it will load it in this container. Here you are seeing home template. If I click on contact, this will become contact template. Let me make it as big, so I can use h1 tag. h1, okay. Now refresh. You are seeing home template and contact template. If I change the URLs, it is loading that particular template over here in the HTML. In the same way, instead of loading the direct template, you should be able to load the template URL also over here. Okay, that loading template URL, those things we will be seeing it in the UI router, right? So now what I am going to do is, here you can load only one level of router. But inside this template, if I want to load another templates, how can I do this? That is not at all possible. So I wanted to do that also. For that, we can't access this Angular router. For that, I wanted to use the UI router. So let's include the Angular UI router instead of Angular router. I'm going to remove this file. Instead of this, I'm including Angular UI router. Let's delete everything. I don't want it. Here also, let me delete this configuration files. Now, this Angular ng router won't be available because we removed and we inserted this Angular UI router. So here you have to inject that particular dependency. So for the Angular UI router, the dependency is UI.router. This is the Angular router module. In the same way, we have to create our configuration file for this UI router in the app. Let's create this app.config. So here for this UI router, we will be having two parameters. One is state provider, another one is URL router provider. Using the state provider, we should be able to create multiple states and you can access those things. So let's pass the two parameters. State provider and $URL router provider. Then you have to create the configuration in the same way. Now what I'm going to do, $state provider dot, before what you have done, you have created when the URL is there, you have to load this. Instead of that, here I will be creating a new state. I'm creating a new state, and for this state I'm creating the configuration. Whenever URL becomes /home, load this particular template. Div h1 home template from UI router /div. Then I want to create another state also. .state. I'm creating one more state called contact. And when the URL is /contacts, load this template. Let me copy paste it so we can save some time. It is loaded from contact template. Okay, now what I have done, the same way however we created a configuration file in the ng router, in the same way I have created the configurations. So you have to define the same in the view. If I want to access, what do we do? First let me create a div href equal to #home /contact. So this is how we will be mentioning our files. Here it should be a contacts. So let me make it as contacts. Okay. Now we define these things. But once it is defined, you have to mention where you have to load this file also. Right? In the same way how we used our UI view, ng view, in the same way we have another directive called UI view. So those files will be loaded in this specific placeholder. Right? Let me refresh this application. You can see there is no error for this. Whenever I click on home, this home template is loaded. Contact template. Once again, it is not refreshed properly because here we are mentioned the template as home template from UI router and this one. Let me open this again. So now you are seeing home template from UI router. And if I go to context, it is showing the context from UI router. Let's make it like a simple application. So I'm going to give some more stylings for this style. Let's call it as a menu. Class main menu. Dot main menu. Border one page solid. Just for separation purpose, I'm giving these stylings. Padding 10 pixels, and here dot main menu inside whatever I have that anchor tag. I'm just pointing that anchor tag and I'm giving some styling over there also. Margin 5 pixels. So it is done. Let's take a look. How does it look like? So normally we have this main tag. Now what I want to do here, instead of loading the templates, instead of loading the templates, I want to load the HTML instead of template. How can we do that? Let's go here. So this is where we have our application in app 1. Here, let me create some more HTML files. New home.html. Let me copy paste it. You have to contact.html and home.html. Let me open those files in the editor. Home.html, it is nothing, empty. In the same way, contact.html, this is also empty. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to give this file name h1 this template loaded from home file, okay, home.html file. The same way I'm going to mention here h1 this file has been loaded from contact.html. Okay, I just created two templates file and I have to give the path instead of this template. Let me remove this. Template URL. We are not mentioning the template now. We are mentioning the template URL. So where do we have those templates? Just in the application itself. You can see the folder. It is over here itself. So you can directly give home.html. And if it is a contact, template URL is contact.html. Now we are loading these two templates over there. Instead of the template, we are loading the HTML files. Now I will show you guys one more thing. If I try to run the same in my Chrome browser, let's see what happens. Let me remove it. Okay. I refresh my browser, nothing is happening. Okay, here you are not at all seeing any other error. But if I click on the home, it is giving a error like cross-origin support error. Because Chrome is having more security, so it is not allowing to load the external file inside the application. This home.html and contact.html are external files. And we can't load those external files. So now here you are seeing it as a file. But if you are loading external another file inside this, it is like cheating the browser. Okay, we are trying to access the external files. So because of the security purpose, Chrome is restricting that. But if you are running it as a web service using the Tomcat or a node service, what will happen? It won't become a file. It will be a local host. At the time, you should be able to load the external applications. Okay, so that is one of the way. Otherwise, what we can do, for now we will run this in the Firefox. Now I am loading. This file has been loaded from the templates, right? So now we are not at all defining the direct HTML in the template. We are loading the file from the HTML. So this is possible from UI router as well as NJ router. But we will see the special case in the UI router. Now what I am going to do, inside this I am going to create one more menu. Class submenu. Submenu, I will be having URL. So here I am going to have two URLs. A href equal to slash hash slash contact slash test1. This will be the test1. And I am going to create the another URL. This is test2. Let's take a look. How does it look like in the browser? Let me create a styling for this. I'm going to fix the width. Width 200 pixels. Float left. And your list style none. Right? So I define this URL. Right here, we loaded the page. If I go to the contact, here you are seeing the another two links also. If I click on this link, it is adding slash contacts slash test1 and test2. For this also, I want to configure my route parameters. So how can I do this? Here, let's go to our route configuration. You need to create the nested states. So I'm going to create a state. This state is coming inside your contact state. So contact dot test1. This is the state name, and you have to mention your URL. If my URL is slash test1. Okay. Now we are not giving contact slash test1. Just we are giving test1. So what does it mean? It is already inside the contact, and for this state we are creating another URL. So instead of creating a template URL, let me create a template. Div loaded template test1. In the same way, let me create another template. Test2, and this URL will be test2. Here, this loaded from test2. Now we have created the child templates. But where do we need to load these templates? That also we have to mention. Here we have the submenu. Over here, let me create the submenu container. Class submenu container. And this will be my UI view. So this view is inside your parent view. The containers will be loaded over here in this view, and the child will be loaded in the main view. To separate this one, let me give some styling for this. So here I'm just giving a border. Border 1 pixel solid B3 and float left. Width is 500 pixels. Okay. Now let's take a look. So it's gone. Let's see what is happening. Let me check whether we have any error. Okay, we missed brace or semicolon. Let's see from the configuration. Okay, here you can see it. I missed comma. Okay, let me refresh. Now everything is set. I have to make this as a proper div. That's why we are not getting the exact look and feel whatever we were expecting. It is class main controller. Main container. Let's give CSS for this. With 100%. It is enough. Fine. Height 200 pixels. Let's take a look now. Now you are seeing. So this is loaded from the contact, but if I click on any other test, it has to load over here. Right? Now you are seeing this. So this is what we have. Instead of this should be a test2. That's why we are getting the same URL. Now you can see your contact controller is loaded here. If you go to home, this is your home. In the contact, again you have one more UI router. From this UI router, we are loading our child routes also. So this is one of the way to access all your files. Okay. Let me go here. This is our child. So let me explain once again. Here, instead of keeping our h1, let me close it over here also. Now you should be able to see. So from here again we are starting our contact.html. In the contact.html again we are loading our child views. This is one of the best feature available in the UI router. And we may have some other problem also. If user types some other URLs over here in the URL, what will happen? It won't load the page. Just it will be there in the same URL because we didn't define this route. For that, what you have to do, if user gives any URL, you can mention that also. URL router provider dot otherwise load / home. What will happen if it is not finding the URL in this configuration? Always it will load the home. Now this is working fine. If I go to contact is loaded, test1 is loaded, test2 is loaded, everything is working as we expected. But if I type anything right here, let me go to this one, and from here I am going to type something else. Whenever I click on enter, automatically it is loading the home. So here we are mentioning, if we are not finding the specified URL, load the HTML. If the URL is not available, otherwise load this HTML. That's what we are defining right here. So this UI router is simple as well as it is having more features compared to NG router. So let's go to the next module. Then we can have 5-minute session for this building custom widgets and this NG router. Let's go here. And the next one is building custom widgets. So to build your own custom widgets in Angular.js, what do we do is, normally we will be using the custom directives. The directives will be having its own functionalities. For example, whatever you see, ng view, that is a directive built by this Angular.js people. So those guys build something. So this directive is acting like a placeholder. In the same way, if you want to build any other custom directives, you can do that by this widgets. Okay. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to create a new widget for like a graph. I want to plot a line graph. For that I wanted to create a graph. Create a widget. So if I just plot the normal graph inside a particular element, what I want to do, each and every time I have to call the graph or I have to create the configuration file. That is not possible. I want to create only one generic widget, and wherever I want, I should be able to access that widget. That is what I am expecting now, that you should be able to create using the custom widgets. So you can create your widgets as a element type or attribute, class or command. So this will be a little bit advanced topic. So let's just concentrate. So now what I'm going to do, let me delete everything. I don't want it. So just we have our app and I don't need my dependency also. I have deleted my dependencies. This one as well. I don't need these files. Home.html, no. Only I need this one. Let me delete everything. Let me have a clear file once again. Delete. Okay, we don't need this Angular file. Now I need only Angular. I don't need any other dependency. Now I am going to build a graph using C3 or D3.js. So for that, what you have to do, you have to include those D3 and C3.js in your file. Script. Your source is, I have it in my library /d3.min.js. Then your C3.js also. So to give the proper look and feel, already C3.js guys is having a style sheet. Let me include that style sheet also. /library/c3.min.css. Okay. Now what I want to do, I wanted to create a widget like a graph, line graph, bar graph, pie graph. These are the things I wanted to create. How can I create this? Let me create a basic controller, div ng controller equal to test controller. Let me define the same controller over here. App.controller, just test controller, and the same however we define, let's mention the scope. Function of your $scope. So we defined our scope side here. Let me create a basic directive. I am going to call this directive as C3 line /C3 line. Now I am creating a new tag. This tag is not at all available in Angular.js, or it is not at all a valid HTML tag. Just I am creating this tag. For this tag, I am going to give a specific functionality. Okay. So for this tag, if you want to create a specific functionality, how do we do that? You can achieve by the custom directives. App directive. This is one of the feature of Angular.js. Directive, and whatever the name you have given, C3 line. C3 line. This directive will return an object. This is the type of the directive, whatever you are doing. So what is this type? It is an element type in the HTML. So if you are defining over here anything like attr, so this is the attribute, but this is the element. So we can mention our directive as a element type. It is a element type. Then if you want to pass any scope variables from your controller, that you can access it in the directive, because each and every time whenever you create the scope, it will create a child scope for the directive. Then you have to share the scope from your controller to directive. For that, you have to create your scope variables. So I am going to pass one data called data, and that will be able to access it in the directive. So for that, we are giving this equal to. So it will be having equal to at and ampersand. Equal to will be able to provide this two-way binding. You can access the data from the controller as well as you can access the data from directive to controller. If you use at, it will be accessing the only the value, the compiled value. Next, ampersand, you should be able to pass the function from the controller. Okay, now just I need only the data. Then the link function. So whenever you load this directive, automatically it will load the link function or a controller function. Now I need only the link function. It will have scope, element and attributes. You can name whatever you want. Just I will be calling this one as name, element and attribute. After that, here I have to write the functionality for my widget. So where C3 graph, or you can call whatever you want. Just I'm going to call it as C3 graph equal to C3.generate. So it is C3 method generate, and you pass the graph configurations. Bind, where do you need to bind this graph? Wherever I am using this element, over there I need to bind the graph. This is what I am giving the element where I need to bind this graph. Next, you have to give the data for this graph. So data, it needs x-axis. X-axis I am going to call it as a x, and columns I will be having some hard-coded data for now. Later we will be pass the data from the controller x. It can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the value for this y, (12, 32, 43, 5, 4). Then you have to mention the type of this graph. Type line. Just I need a line graph. Now we defined a basic directive. So whenever I try to access the directive as C3, so it will give this specific graph. Let's try this. Let me open it in the browser. Now it is giving this line graph. Am I right? So but I hard-coded this data. So it is not at all a useful directive for me. So whatever data I want to pass it from the controller, I want to use that data. So for example, I want to show the information of cricket score, right? So let's do this. $scope dot score. Score is equal to, I'm going to define it as per over whatever the score. My x-axis will be my over. First to over. My y-axis will be a score. First to over 10 runs. In the same way, let me give this for 5 overs. Second over, third over, it's fine. Second over, third over, fourth over, and fifth over. Okay, so in the same way, you can give whatever you want. First over, 2 runs, second over, 8 runs, 12, 19, and again 5 runs or 6 runs. Okay, now this score I want to pass it from my controller to directive. So we have created a scope variable for this directive. For that you should be able to pass this controller scope. Now you should be able to access this scores over there, but it is expecting it as an array. So you have to convert your object into array. How can we do? Get columns. I am creating one JavaScript function as a get columns. Function get columns. So the same thing, right? I have to check whether I didn't make any typos. But x equal to empty array, I'm going to define this, and y equal to, it is also empty array. Let me define inside y one of the variable. Then I will be having the full scorecard details in the scope object. I want to look through and I need to build the JSON object. For where I equal to 0, I less than scope.data.length I plus plus. So let me build this object. So x.push scope.data of I dot x. So x-axis will be pushed to the x. In the same way, y.push scope.data of I dot y. So x and y-axis will be pushed to this. Let me return this as a data. Return array x comma y. Now whatever data you passed from the controller, that will be passed to this widget and you should be able to result that. Refresh. I think so we are getting some JavaScript error. Length is not defined. first I have to check whether can I access this data. Right? So first we will check over here, can we access the scores? So where do we have our directive and the C3 line? Here, this is what the controller, what we define. Let's go here, refresh. Now you should be able to access the data. Let me delete this. So that time we didn't save it properly, that's why. Now you are seeing my first over I defined as a score as 2, second over 6, third over whatever scores I defined, it is coming. In the same way, you should be able to create different types of widgets. Now I created a normal C3 graph. Okay, in the same way, I wanted to create bar graph or pie graph, everything. You can create it only once. Now, if I call this C3 graph again, I need not to make a call once again. Just I will call the graph, and instead of scores, I wanted to show the employee's salary or whatever it is. Okay, let me make it as salary. I'm going to create one more scope variable. Okay, here I'm creating one more scope variable called sal. The sal will be having array. Here you can mention your x-axis, y-axis. That will be displayed in the next graph. My x-axis will be 10, 1, y will be 10,000. So my first employee is having 10,000k, second employee, third employee, like this. You can mention whatever you wanted to. So just we created the widget, so it should be reusable everywhere. Now, if I refresh the page, you will be getting two graphs. One is for your scores, another one is for your salary, whatever we built. Right? So let's make it as 2, 3, 4. In the same way, if you want to build any kind of custom graphs, everything is possible. Just if you want the next one, just copy paste it and pass the data. We are just passing the data for this widget, it is creating the graph. In the same way, whatever business logic you want to build it, you can build it in the widget and you can reuse it anywhere in the application. That is the best use of creating widgets in Angular.js. Let's go to the next slide. We have seen the demo of building Angular.js widgets. Next, so if we register this Angular.js course with our Edureka, so what are all the topics we will be covering? First session, we will be covering the introduction to JavaScript, MVC framework, and the Angularjs. So each and every module, it will take 3 hours of time. Okay. So the first session will be taking 3 hours of time, and over there we will be explaining you the introduction to JavaScript framework and Angularjs. The next session will be dependency injections and controllers. How can we share the data between controllers using services and factory? Third, we will be discussing more about the routes, directives, and filters. In the fourth session, we will build our own components. However, we build the basic graph. In the same way, we will be building some complex graph like drag and drop and do this and everything. The fifth one will be the third-party modules. Now we have seen one is the UI router. In the same way, we have many third-party modules like ng storage or ng grid. So we will be discussing more about the third-party module and testing. So how can we do unit test case for the Angularjs? We will be discussing about that in our fifth module. In our sixth module, we will build an end-to-end web application with AngularJS, Node.js, and we will be using the project generators like Yeoman and Task Runner like Grunt, those things. We will be covering our sixth module. Last, we will build an end-to-end web application using Angular and Node modules. These are all the topics we will be covering if you are registering with our Edureka session. Okay, so what are all the features we have in our Edureka? First one, you will be having the live online classes. Each and every module will be taking the live online classes, and everything will be recorded and it will be available in our LMS. So then, if you have any other doubt, our support team will be available for 24/7. So you can ask your queries over there. So 24/7 support team also is available. Each and every module is having its own course, so we can test our knowledge, what we learned in this specific module. And at last, you will be having a project work. You can build an end-to-end web application with Angular, Node, everything. At last, you will be getting a certificate from our Edureka that you can link it to your LinkedIn profile. So do you guys have any questions? We'll spend 5 more minutes. I will be answering for your questions, guys. So if you have any questions, please post it. So okay, from Pranav we have a question. What is app config? So app config is one of the module available in this Angular.js. So whenever you are building it as a config method, if you launch your application, first it will come to the config method. Over there, whatever the functionality you have written, that will be executed inside this app config. So from Kritish we have a question. Let us know cost for this. So all the price details will be available in our Edureka page. You can go over there, check for the Edureka page. There will be the timings as well as the price for this course also will be available. You can get it from there. So from Vinay we have a question. Can we make any scope variable dependent on another scope variable? So if you want to make a dependent scope variables, what you have to do, only one way is you have to pass the reference of your scope variable. Then only you are changing the one scope variable, automatically the another scope variable will be changed. So that only that way you can dependent on another scope variables. So from Ankit we have a question. Can we ng bind instead data attribute in C3 line element? So in the C3 line element, whatever we created, that is a widget. So if you are using ng bind, what will happen? Just we will be taking the data from the controller out. But I have to pass the data. If any change happens from the controller, I have to reflect back to the controller. That's why we are using this isolated scopes and scope variables inside our directive. We are not binding the data. So from Neeraj we have a question. Is Angular.js is a first MVC framework? It is not a first MVC framework. Already Ember.js, Backbone and Knockout are there. Those are all the MVC framework for the client side. But it is better than those frameworks. Because if you compare in the Angular.js, there are nearly 30,000 developers. So if 30,000 developers means, if you are getting any other queries, you can post it in the forum, you will be getting quick answer. Another one, there will be more modules available. So if you want to build anything, you need not to build everything from your scratch. Already modules will be available. Just include those modules as a dependency into your project. You should be able to access it. So personally, if you ask me, I feel this Angular.js is better than Ember and the Backbone. So from Neeraj, we have a question. How is Angular.js better than jQuery? First thing, we should not compare Apple with orange. In the same way, Angular.js is different and jQuery is different. Angular.js is a framework, but jQuery is just a library. So it is having only the framework, only the functionalities whatever we can implement. So they created on top of JavaScript. So we can access all these JavaScript functionalities in a simple way. But Angular.js is a framework. You can build an end-to-end web application with proper structure. It is far, far better than this jQuery. So anyway, you can't compare, but if you are comparing, it is far, far better. So do you guys have any other question? Otherwise, from Amit, last question. From Amit, we have a question. What is the difference between MVC controller and Angular controller? So now MVC controller means most of this is same. So what we are doing, we are restricting the access. For the normal MVC controller, what we do, we will restrict access over here. How can you share the data between the things, or how can we navigate to the pages? Here in our AngularJS controller, we will be writing our business logics, and this will be the model for your data. Okay, so all the data will be shared from the controller, and in the controller you will be having $watch and digest methods. So if your model changes, automatically this watch gets triggered and it will update the view. If a view changes, the watch will get triggered in the controller and it updates the model. These concepts will be available in Angular controller. So what is factory? Okay, so factory is one of the another feature available in AngularJS. It is, so if you want to share the data between the controllers, I will create a factory. In the factory, I can create one more variable or function. So I will inject the factory into the one controller. Whenever I change the scope, I will push that scope variable to the factory. So the same factory you can inject into the other controller. If you want to interact between two controllers, you can't inject one controller into the another controller, but you can inject the factories. So inside one factory, I will inject the scope variables, whatever I wanted to put, and I will inject that factory to the another controller. Over there, you can share the data. So mainly we will be using this factory to share the data between the controllers. So from Pranam we have a question. Can we list as much as URL config in the app config? So app config is not only for this URL configurations. So you can do any operations over there in the app config. But we have to define our configurations on the page load. So whenever your applications loads, we have to come to some particular method and I want to do some operations. That's why we are doing it in the app config. So in the app config, using our URL UI router or ng router, you can load any template, any number of templates. There is no restriction for it. Okay guys, really thank you very much for registering the session. If you have more questions or anything, suggest you can come over and you can attend our AngularJS session in the Edureka. We will be covering all the topics. End to end, we will be covering these AngularJS sessions. Thank you very much guys. Let's see you in the session. Bye.